September 3rd, 1943. The ornate conference room in the Palazzo del Quirinale was suffocating with tension that no amount of marble grandeur could dispel. Around the massive mahogany table sat Italy's most powerful men, their faces carefully neutral masks hiding the terror beneath. Field Marshal Pietro Badoglio sat at the head of the table, his weathered hands folded precisely in front of him. To his right, General Mario Roata shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Across from them, Admiral Raphael de Courten stared at documents he'd read a dozen times already. The silence stretched for nearly 10 minutes before anyone dared speak. Finally, Badoglio cleared his throat and spoke the words that would define Italy's fate. Gentlemen, we must acknowledge what these intelligence reports are telling us. Mussolini's regime is finished, and we are about to pay the price for 20 years of his delusions. The room remained silent because everyone knew he was right. September 3rd marked exactly 6 weeks since Mussolini's arrest on July 25th, and the implications were becoming catastrophically clear. Italy had lost the war's initiative, possibly forever. The terrible irony was that Mussolini's alliance with Hitler, meant to restore Italian greatness, had instead guaranteed Italy's destruction. To understand how these generals reached this devastating conclusion, we need to go back 21 years to October 28, 1922. That day, Benito Mussolini's march on Rome achieved what he called a revolution without revolution. King Victor Emmanuel III, faced with fascist paramilitaries converging on the capital, appointed Mussolini prime minister rather than risk civil war. The decision seemed pragmatic at the time. Mussolini promised order, prosperity, and the restoration of Italian greatness. For the next decade, many Italians believed he was delivering. Mussolini drained swamps, built roads, made trains run on time, and projected an image of strength that contrasted sharply with the political chaos of the previous decade. He promised to restore the glory of ancient Rome, to make Italy a great power again, to build an empire that would rival Britain and France. The rhetoric was intoxicating, the spectacle magnificent, and the results, initially, seemed impressive. But beneath the propaganda and pageantry, fundamental weaknesses were already apparent to those paying attention. Italy's industrial base was a fraction of Germany's size. Italian steel production was perhaps 1/10 of British output. Italy had virtually no oil, no significant coal deposits, and limited strategic raw materials. The Italian military looked impressive in parades, but was equipped with outdated weapons and hampered by chronic supply shortages. Most critically, Mussolini had surrounded himself with yes-men who told him what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to know. Any advisor who questioned his grandiose plans was dismissed as defeatist. Any general who suggested caution was accused of lacking fighting spirit. The entire government structure had been corrupted by the need to flatter Mussolini's ego rather than address strategic realities. The first major test came in 1935 with the invasion of Ethiopia. Mussolini declared this would demonstrate Italian military prowess and provide the empire Italy deserved. The campaign succeeded, but at enormous cost. Italy used poison gas against primitive opponents, committed massive resources to conquering territory with no strategic value, and faced international sanctions that damaged the economy. Worse, the Ethiopian War revealed the Italian military's fundamental weaknesses to anyone willing to see them. General Rodolfo Graziani, who commanded the invasion, privately reported that Italian logistics were chaotic, equipment frequently failed, and coordination between different branches of the military was almost non-existent. But Mussolini heard only what he wanted to hear about glorious victories and restored Roman greatness. The Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939 provided another preview of disaster. Mussolini sent 75,000 troops to support Francisco Franco, viewing it as preparation for the larger war he believed was coming. Italian forces performed poorly. Suffering embarrassing defeats and requiring constant reinforcement, the conflict consumed resources Italy couldn't spare and demonstrated that Italian military doctrine was fundamentally flawed. But again, Mussolini focused on the eventual nationalist victory rather than the lessons about Italian military capabilities. He convinced himself that Italian fighting spirit had been decisive, ignoring reports about equipment failures, tactical confusion, and the superior performance of German units fighting alongside Italian forces. By 1940, these accumulated delusions led to the decision that would destroy Italy. When Germany achieved rapid victories in Poland, Norway, Belgium, and France, Mussolini became convinced that the war was nearly over and that Italy needed to join immediately to claim its share of the spoils. On June 10, 1940, he declared war on Britain and France, famously telling his generals that he needed only a few thousand Italian dead to sit at the peace conference as a belligerent. The calculation was catastrophically wrong. The war wasn't nearly over. Britain didn't surrender after France fell. Instead of a quick victory, followed by territorial gains, Italy found itself committed to a prolonged conflict against enemies with vastly superior industrial and naval capabilities. The disasters began almost immediately. In North Africa, Italian forces under Marshal Graziani advanced into Egypt, but were quickly overwhelmed by much smaller British forces. In 3 months, the British destroyed 10 Italian divisions, captured 130,000 prisoners, and advanced 500 miles into Libya. Only German intervention prevented the complete collapse of the North African front. In Greece, Mussolini launched an invasion in October 1940 without consulting Hitler, believing it would be a simple matter of Italian superiority over Greek weakness. Instead, Greek forces not only stopped the Italian advance, but counterattacked, pushing Italian armies back into Albania and threatening to drive them into the sea. Again, only German interventions saved Italian forces from complete destruction. The pattern was unmistakable to military professionals. Italian equipment was inferior, Italian logistics were chaotic, Italian coordination was poor, and Italian strategic planning was based on wishful thinking rather than realistic assessment of capabilities. Every operation revealed new weaknesses, new gaps between fascist propaganda and military reality. But Mussolini refused to acknowledge these failures. Greek resistance was blamed on British interference. North African setbacks were attributed to German reluctance to provide adequate support. Equipment failures were dismissed as temporary problems. Tactical defeats were reframed as strategic withdrawals. The system Mussolini had created made honest assessment impossible because anyone who provided honest assessment was treated as a traitor to the regime. By 1943, the accumulated weight of these delusions had created an impossible strategic situation. Italy was fighting on multiple fronts with inadequate resources. The North African campaign had consumed enormous quantities of men and material for no strategic gain. The occupation of the Balkans required hundreds of thousands of troops to suppress constant resistance. The Eastern Front, where Mussolini had sent an entire army to support German operations, had become a catastrophic drain on Italian resources. Meanwhile, Allied strategic bombing was systematically destroying Italian industrial capacity. The Royal Air Force, and later the United States Army Air Forces, targeted Italian factories, ports, and transportation networks with increasing effectiveness. Italian aircraft production, already insufficient, declined dramatically. Fuel shortages grounded much of the Italian Air Force. Naval operations became increasingly difficult as oil imports were cut off by Allied naval superiority. The invasion of Sicily in July 1943 demonstrated the complete collapse of Italian military effectiveness. Despite fighting on home territory with prepared defences, Italian forces crumbled within days. Entire divisions surrendered without significant resistance. The German units fighting alongside Italian forces had to cover enormous gaps left by Italian withdrawals. It was this collapse that finally convinced Italy's political and military leadership that Mussolini's regime was finished. The meeting in the Palazzo del Quirinale on September 3rd was convened specifically to address intelligence reports that painted an even grimmer picture than the Sicilian disaster suggested. General Roatta spread aerial reconnaissance photographs across the table, each image documenting the systematic destruction of Italian military infrastructure. Allied bombers were hitting targets with precision that suggested comprehensive intelligence about Italian defensive positions. But the photographs revealed something more disturbing than simple tactical intelligence. They showed that Italian forces were abandoning positions before Allied attacks even began. Entire coastal defense installations had been evacuated without orders. Artillery pieces were being spiked by their own crews. Supply depots were being emptied by soldiers taking whatever they could carry before disappearing into the countryside. This wasn't tactical withdrawal. This was the dissolution of military discipline on a scale that made formal surrender almost irrelevant. The Italian army was simply ceasing to exist as a coherent fighting force. Admiral de Courten presented naval statistics that were equally devastating. The Italian fleet, once Mussolini's pride and the supposed guarantee of Mediterranean dominance, had become effectively trapped in port. Fuel shortages meant that major operations were impossible. Even routine patrols had been curtailed to preserve what little oil remained. Most critically, Italian naval codes had been compromised so thoroughly that every ship movement was known to Allied forces before execution. The submarine fleet, which had shown promise early in the war, was being systematically hunted down by Allied anti-submarine warfare techniques that Italian technology couldn't counter. In the past 6 months, Italy had lost more submarines than it could build in 2 years. The survivors were increasingly reluctant to leave port, knowing that each patrol was likely to be their last. But perhaps most damaging was the intelligence assessment of German intentions toward Italy. Intercepted German communications revealed that Hitler's staff was already planning for Italian surrender. German forces in Italy were being repositioned not to defend Italian territory, but to establish defensive lines that would hold regardless of Italian participation. The Germans were treating Italy not as an ally, but as occupied territory that would soon require direct administration. This realization struck at the core of Mussolini's entire strategic vision. For 3 years, he had justified Italian sacrifices by claiming that Germany valued Italian partnership and that joint victory would restore Italian greatness. The intercepted communications revealed that Germany viewed Italy as a liability to be managed rather than a partner to be respected. Field Marshal Kesselring's communications were particularly damning. He described Italian forces as unreliable and Italian defensive positions as untenable. More significantly, he outlined plans for German forces to take control of key Italian infrastructure, including ports, airfields, and transportation networks, the moment Italian surrender became official. The Germans weren't preparing to defend Italy. They were preparing to occupy it. General Roatta presented the most chilling intelligence of all, reports from German concentration camps that documented the fate of Italian military personnel captured on various fronts. Unlike British or American prisoners, who were treated according to Geneva Convention standards, Italian prisoners were being subjected to forced labor, deliberate starvation, and systematic brutality designed to break their will to resist. These reports suggested that German attitudes toward Italians had shifted dramatically since the early days of the alliance. What had begun as partnership between fascist movements had devolved into German contempt for Italian weakness and Italian resentment of German domination. The Axis alliance was dissolving from within, held together only by Mussolini's desperate need to maintain the illusion of relevance. The economic situation presented by Finance Minister Guido Jung was catastrophic in ways that transcended military considerations. Italian industrial production had declined by 60% since 1940. Agricultural output had fallen by 40% due to conscription of farm workers and disruption of transportation networks. Food rationing had been tightened repeatedly, but supplies were still insufficient to maintain civilian morale. More critically, Italy's financial reserves were essentially exhausted. The country was surviving on German credits that came with increasingly onerous conditions. Germany was demanding Italian raw materials, industrial equipment, and even art treasures as payment for continued military support. Italy was being systematically stripped of assets while receiving inadequate assistance in return. The currency situation was particularly desperate. The lira had lost 70% of its value since 1940, making imports prohibitively expensive. This created a vicious cycle where Italy couldn't afford the raw materials needed for industrial production, which further weakened the economy and military capabilities. But Jung's most devastating revelation concerned German economic planning for Italy. Captured documents revealed that Germany was preparing to treat Italy as a colonial possession, extracting resources and labor while providing minimal support for Italian economic recovery. The partnership Mussolini had envisioned was actually a form of economic subjugation that would leave Italy impoverished for decades. The discussion turned to the question of alternatives. Could Italy negotiate a separate peace with the Allies while somehow avoiding German retaliation? The intelligence assessments were pessimistic. Germany had already demonstrated its willingness to occupy countries that attempted to leave the Axis. Hungary and Romania were essentially under German military administration, despite nominal independence. More importantly, German forces in Italy were positioned to seize control of key installations the moment Italian defection became apparent. The Germans had learned from the Italian armistice negotiations with the Allies, which had been conducted in secret but were apparently known to German intelligence services. This raised the terrifying possibility that Germany was simply waiting for Italy to formally surrender before implementing plans for complete occupation. Italian forces might find themselves fighting not just Allied invaders, but German occupiers simultaneously. General Roata outlined the military implications of this scenario. Italian forces were dispersed across multiple fronts and couldn't be concentrated quickly enough to resist German occupation. The best Italian divisions were in Sicily or North Africa, cut off from the mainland and unable to influence events in Italy itself. The remaining forces on the peninsula were demoralized, under-equipped, and positioned to defend against Allied invasion rather than German occupation. Even more problematic was the question of Italian civilian loyalty. 20 years of fascist propaganda had convinced many Italians that Germany was Italy's natural ally and that the Allies represented foreign domination. A sudden shift to fighting alongside Britain and America against Germany would create massive confusion and potential civil war. The meeting revealed the complete bankruptcy of Mussolini's strategic vision. Every major decision he had made since 1935 had weakened Italy's position while strengthening its enemies. The Ethiopian War had isolated Italy internationally while revealing military weaknesses. The Spanish intervention had consumed resources while providing minimal strategic benefit. The alliance with Germany had subordinated Italian interests to German ambitions. The declaration of war in 1940 had committed Italy to conflicts it couldn't win with allies who didn't respect Italian contributions. Most devastatingly, Mussolini's leadership style had created a system where accurate information couldn't reach decision-makers and realistic planning was impossible. The very qualities that had made him an effective political leader, his charisma, his certainty, his ability to inspire through rhetoric, had become liabilities in strategic planning that required careful analysis of complex realities. The generals sitting in that conference room understood that they were witnessing the consequences of systematic delusion elevated to state policy. For 20 years, Italy had been governed by wishful thinking rather than strategic assessment. The price for that delusion was becoming apparent in the most catastrophic way possible. Catastrophic way possible. Badoglio stood slowly, his chair scraping against the marble floor with a sound that seemed to echo the gravity of their situation. He walked to the window overlooking the gardens, his back to the assembled officers. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who understood that history would judge every word uttered in this room. The question before us isn't whether Mussolini's regime has failed. That question was answered in Sicily, in North Africa, in Greece, and in every theatre where Italian forces have engaged the enemy. The question is whether Italy itself will survive what comes next. The silence that followed was absolute. Every man in that room had built his career within the fascist system. They had worn the uniforms, taken the oaths, and participated in the ceremonies that legitimized Mussolini's rule. Now they were being asked to confront the possibility that everything they had served was not just wrong, but catastrophically destructive to the nation they claimed to protect. General Ambrosio, chief of the General Staff, finally broke the silence with a voice that barely rose above a whisper. The intelligence reports from our agents in Germany paint an even grimmer picture than what we've discussed. Hitler's inner circle views Italy's eventual surrender not as a betrayal to be punished, but as an inevitability to be exploited. He pulled out a leather portfolio containing documents so sensitive they bore no official markings. These communications between German commanders reveal operational plans for something called Fall Axe, Case Axis. The moment Italy attempts to leave the war, German forces will implement immediate occupation of all strategic points throughout the peninsula. They're not planning to defend Italy with us. They're planning to defend Italy from us. The implications were staggering. Germany had been preparing for Italian defection while publicly maintaining the facade of alliance. Every German unit stationed in Italy served dual purposes, supporting current operations while positioning for future occupation. Every German advisor embedded with Italian forces was simultaneously gathering intelligence about Italian capabilities and weaknesses. Admiral de Courten leaned forward, his weathered face reflecting years of naval service that had taught him to read storms before they struck. Our naval intelligence has identified at least 8 German divisions that have been quietly repositioned over the past month. They're not reinforcing the front lines. They're surrounding our major ports, airfields, and communication centres. The Admiral spread a map across the table, marking German positions with red pins. Look at this pattern. Rome, Naples, Milan, Turin, all the industrial centres surrounded by German forces ostensibly there for rest and refitting. But notice the positioning. They're not deployed for external defence. They're positioned for internal control. General Roata studied the map with the eye of a professional who had spent decades analysing enemy intentions. The Germans have learned from every previous occupation. They studied what went wrong in Norway, in Denmark, in the Netherlands. They're not going to repeat those mistakes in Italy. September 3rd, 1943, was the day Italy's military leadership finally acknowledged what the mathematics of war had been screaming for months. Mussolini's regime wasn't just failing, it was finished, destroyed by the same delusions that had created it. The generals in that marble conference room understood they were witnessing the consequences of 20 years of wishful thinking elevated to state policy. Italy had chosen fantasy over reality, propaganda over planning, and now the price was becoming clear in the most catastrophic way imaginable. The nation that had dreamed of restoring Roman greatness would instead face German occupation and Allied invasion simultaneously, all because one man's ego had been valued more than strategic truth.